You got problems that you ought to be concerned with. Moolah. You don't know how you're supposed to earn it, or what to do with it, or how to keep it. You're a freak with a dark, shameful secret. But you're not the only one. Get your hidden financial fears with a blast of sun. Now your healing has begun. It's Bad with Money with
Gabe S.
Done.
Hello and welcome to Bad with Money, a show about finances and feelings where we don't talk down to you. I'm your host, Gabe S. Dunn, and I am thrilled today to welcome Tourmaline. Will you tell my audience who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so my name is Tourmaline, and for the past 20 years, I've been writing, educating my community about, and studying the life of Marsha P. Johnson through art and activism and organizing.
I actually just read your work on Mary Jones, and that was like so fascinating. And I had never heard of her before.
Yeah, so Mary Jones, for people who don't know, was a Black trans woman who lived in New York City in Soho in the 1830s. And she was, really like Marsha, similarly turning the volume up on her life and her truth. She lived in this brothel on Green Street. So she was, involved in the sex industry, and she was just a powerful person. And then she was arrested, and the city had a huge response and named her a man monster and made these lithographs about her. And I made a film about her, kind of like reimagining her story through a kind of speculative science fiction fantasy lens.
Yeah, just go look her up. It's so cool and such a wild story. And I was like, everything that she was doing, I was like, this rules, especially in like the time period, it was like 1836 or something. Well, you were talking about living in Florida, and I'm from Florida, and it's sort of this thing of we've always been here. When did you first hear about Marsha P. Johnson, and when did you start really looking into her life?
This was over 20 years ago. I moved to New York when I was a teenager, and I was a student at Columbia, and I would take, for people who know geographically Manhattan, I would take that one train all the way down to Christopher Street, the West Village, where something in my head just told me that this was a place to be. And I started to spend time with, like my now community. So other queer, trans, gender nonconforming people of color. We were young people, and we were, showing up and showing out. And it was on Christopher Street and in the West Village that I started to hear about this person, Marsha P. Johnson, and Stonewall. And there was nothing about her on the internet. And so you couldn't really go look her up. That was work that I, started to do. But I heard from her loved ones, people who had already started to do research about her life and archive and share her story. And to me, I was captivated. And I was really in this moment where, historical erasure of our community of transgender nonconforming people felt so important to talk about, and felt so important to lift up the stories of people who paved a way for us to be here. And Marsha was one of them. She was involved in the Stonewall Uprising, which that's why we celebrate Pride every June. She was a leader in fighting back against police violence of her community at Stonewall in June of 1969. And she also fought for things like childcare, healthcare, incarcerated, queer and transgender nonconforming people. She was a care worker in the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And so she has this incredibly beautiful legacy that we're celebrating today. And we're still learning lessons from today as well.
So you started hearing about her, and then you realized there wasn't a whole lot of research about her. What year was this?
2004 or 5.
Okay, yeah, which is kind of wild to think about because I feel like she's brought up so much now.
It was such a different landscape.
Huge difference.
It was an incredibly different landscape. Yeah.
So you were learning about her, and where did you start finding stuff? Like, where did the research start?
So all over the place. I remember I have a friend, AJ Lewis, who took me into the New York Public Library at that time. And there's this journalist, Arthur Bell, who used to write for The Village Voice, which is a kind of storied New York City newspaper. And Arthur wrote a lot about Sylvia Rivera, one of Marsha's friends and contemporaries. And so we just decided to look in Arthur Bell's box for anything that was there. And I remember finding the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionary. It was called STAR. That was the group that she made their manifesto in Arthur Bell's box at the New York Public Library right around this time. And it just felt so meaningful to see the traces and imprints of someone whose life came before me and allowed for mine to blossom and grow. And then I met other friends. I became friends with her longtime roommate, Randy Wicker, who was a LGBTQIA plus activist. He was an activist before Stonewall in 1966. He did a sit-in at a straight bar, Julius, which is now an iconic gay bar in the West Village, and refused to not be served. At the time, serving openly gay people was illegal in New York City. And so I just started to really get close to and learn from and listen to people who knew and loved Marsha, her nephew Al Michaels and Elizabeth, now her brother and sister, and the incredible musician Anoni. So I just have been really blessed to gather and be in this constellation of people who knew and loved Marsha and still do for the past 20 years.
What year was she born?
She was born 1945, and she moved to New York City in Times Square in 1963, right after graduating high school.
Wow. Because I'm just thinking about the timeline. When did she transition and start going out in this way?
Yeah. So after, she talks about how something in her head just told her to move from Elizabeth, New Jersey to Times Square. At the time, today we think about like the West Village as that kind of like LGBTQIA plus safe haven, that queer, trans, gender nonconforming place. But at the time, Times Square was actually where people who were transgressing gender norms went and called community and made a life together. So she was also an actress, and it had the added benefit of being right on Broadway. So she was not only called to her community, but she was shining her light. If anyone who's been to Times Square, you see a lot of street performers, and she was one of those street performers back then. She did a bit called Change for a Starving Actress right in front of Broadway theaters. And so that's when she started to learn about her community. She was a waitress at this restaurant called Childs that Vanity Fair at the time said has a dash of lavender, kind of like hinting at its underculture, queer life. And so outside Childs, all of these street queens like Sylvia Rivera were hanging out. And Sylvia was 11 years old when she moved to Times Square and 13 when she met Marsha. So if we just think about this landscape, it was all of these young queer, transgender, nonconforming people who were not feeling safe at home, who left home and gathered together. And it's just remarkable that they found each other.
Okay, so yeah, this reminds me of the kids that are interviewed on the street in Paris is Burning.
Exactly.
Like that age. They're so young. They, that's the definition of found family, is like leaving this behind and finding these people that are similar to you, which maybe we take for granted in the internet age, because you had to really search for this stuff. I mean, you had to hear a dash of lavender, know what that meant, and then kind of go hang out around there.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, it must have been so brave to do that. Like, what was the reaction to you?
New York City had masquerading laws, which, if you were a trans or gender nonconforming person and you were not wearing 3 articles of clothes with the gender that you were assigned at birth, you could be arrested and put in jail. That law actually stayed on New York State's books until 2020, 5 years ago, when Governor Andrew Cuomo took it off, because it also had to do with masks. So because of COVID, that's why that ended up getting taken off the books. But there's a real afterlife of anti-cross-dressing laws, right? And so it's really wild to think about the New York Police Department raided gay bars using that law in order to, Seymour Pine, who led the raid at Stonewall, used that law to show how gay bars were operating illegally because they had a presence of trans people. And so, you would be arrested and put in jail. And so what they did was whenever they had a little bit of money, they rented these hourly hotels in Times Square. They called them hot spring hotels because whether it was winter, spring, fall, or summer, you couldn't open the window and the heat was blasting. And it was insufferable, but they used that place as a place of sanctuary to dream beyond the harsh conditions that they were navigating every day and to think of a world where they could be more free.
And so they would wear what they wanted in those places.
Yeah, they would wear what they wanted in the hourly hotels. You know, some of them would. Sylvia Rivera, 13, was wearing makeup to work. She got a job in the accounting office at Child's Restaurant, which was really kind of fun to think about. And maybe like, you know, I grew up in the 80s, so I think about these kind of like sitcoms or whatever, where it's like situation comedies where I can only imagine like a Sylvia and a Marsha both working at the restaurant. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
I just think about that. I really want to see that personally.
I've done a lot of work with Jonathan Ned Katz because we had been working on a television show about Eve Adams, who is kind of in sort of the opposite. She's 1920s, but there's sort of the opposite where it's like she was a gender variant in the sense that she wore a lot of gentleman's clothes and was like an out lesbian and was sort of demonized for that, obviously, and was hanging out in the West Village area as well. It's just like wild to think about how buried that stuff is, because Jonathan found her, like saw writing about her in research on Emma Goldman.
Wow.
And he wrote the book on her, but he had to search for little pieces. Like he found all these little pieces of her and put together this book. And it's like when you're talking about going through Arthur Bell's box, it's like it makes me think of how we have to dig so much to find our history, and like someone has to go and absolutely like scrape around for information about these people who, I mean, how do you feel about the hidden, what is it like to find something like that? Do you feel like jackpot?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it has been the underpinning mission of the past 20 years of my life, over 20 years, you know. So I'm 42 and I started doing this. I was so blessed. There's a writer and theorist, Robin D.G. Kelley, who was my professor. He wrote a book called Freedom Dreams, and that's kind of in line with how Marsha saw the world, right? She dreamed beyond the harsh conditions. I was his student, and then, you know, I sent him the book to blurb, and it was just so meaningful to be reflected back that this has been something that I've just been doing for over half my life, and writing about Marsha, because I was writing about Marsha for his class. To me, it's been knowing, and this was like 2005, for me, it's been just a blessing, you know, to get close through the dispersed archive, whether it's Randy Wicker's living room or a box that's not labeled at the New York Public Library, or Al Michaels, Marsha's nephew, to get close to those stories, right? It just has incredibly added value and understanding of my own value, right? And my own beauty and the importance of us. So, yeah, I think that while it is so real that we are being taken out of the archive, right? The National Park Service scrubbed mention of both Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera off of their websites, and specifically around the Stonewall National Monument, which to me is just so bizarre and so wild. They like took it off of their website. Luckily, like NPR and a lot of press started to cover that. You can't do that without making more pronounced my desire and other people's desire to get to know this person, right? And to get to know our community. So.
Very recently, I used Indeed to get hired for a part-time job. The employer put their job listing up on Indeed. That's where I found it. I applied through Indeed and I got the job. Indeed made the hiring process so easy. I was able to search for all kinds of jobs based on my skills and being able to look at really easy to read descriptions from the jobs about what they were looking for in a candidate. If I needed to hire someone again, I would absolutely use Indeed. And I also have been telling everyone when they've been saying that they want to look for a job or they don't know where to find a job, I was like, you got to use Indeed. I've literally told like 4 people like, oh, I found this job on Indeed. That's where you should look if you're looking to find a job. And the job I was looking for, they needed someone really quickly because they were growing so fast. So they needed to hire the right person very fast, and it was so important. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job posts seen on other job sites. Indeed sponsored jobs help you stand out and hire fast. With sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. And it makes a huge difference. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. I sincerely love Indeed. I went on there. It was incredibly easy. I literally got hired in September for a job actually using Indeed. I know this is a podcast ad, but I mean it. I really did use Indeed. I really do recommend Indeed. It all happened so fast, and I didn't even have to really stress. I found what I wanted. I got the job. Plus, with Indeed sponsored jobs, there are no monthly subscriptions, no long-term contracts, and you only pay for results. How fast is Indeed? In the minute I've been talking to you, 23 hires were made on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. And if you're looking to hire, you need to use Indeed because you'll find people like me. There's no need to wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/badwithmoney. Just go to Indeed.com/badwithmoney right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/badwithmoney. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, Indeed is all you need. It's just like wild because do you think she thought you would be doing this? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's really wonderful. There's this beautiful interview of Marsha a few weeks before she died. And she looks in the camera and she says, "To anybody who's writing my life story, I want to thank all the people that helped me up the hill," right? She's talking about all the people who supported her getting through her life. And just a few weeks before she died. And she says specifically my mom and my dad and all the people from Elizabeth, New Jersey. So in some ways, I think she was really aware of this kind of time travel connection, this lineage that she existed in, and that was going to carry on her legacy. And that just sent me like goosebumps and chills when I saw that, because she was talking to me, like I am the person who is. So that was a really beautiful moment. Yeah.
Wow. How did she pass away?
Yeah, so I spend a little bit of time, a whole chapter in the book talking about that. She was a person who was constantly, like we talked about, navigating street-based violence. She was shot in 1981 by a client on the West Side Highway, a taxi car driver, and she lived with a bullet in her back for 11 years. It was too close to her spine, so the doctors didn't remove it, which really impacted her capacity to show up in the world and sleep. Like she had to sleep on hard surfaces. Also, she was a performer, right? She was doing 2 performances a day. It impacted her capacity to travel with the Hot Peaches, which was the performance troupe one of them that she was in. And she talked about living with a bullet in her back in the context of being a cat with 9 lives, someone who was constantly surviving violence. And so there's a lot of different theories about how she died. Some people saw her being harassed in July of 1992 before her body was found in the Hudson River. Other people talk about how she didn't get adequate psychiatric care, right? She lived with psychiatric disabilities and she was not receiving adequate care. And so that impacted and affected how she was in the world. And so whether, she saw someone and walked onto the water, or whether she was chased in the water or pushed into the water, there's a lot of different ideas about how she died. And I explore all of them at length in the book.
It's fascinating that we don't talk about that. It's giving me, especially when you mentioned Seymour Price, whose name I've never heard. I assume the police officer who led the riot.
Yeah, exactly.
Never heard that name. Whenever a Black person is the victim of police violence, they do a passive headline. Motorist dies, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, who shot him?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's deeply giving that. It's like, wow, Marsha and Sylvia rose up and they fought against these nameless police officers. And I'm like, no, name them.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so important that we are really in this moment when we're navigating similar landscapes. Marsha came up in kind of a post-Eisenhower era. Eisenhower was writing these executive orders, scrubbing trans and gender nonconforming people and queer people from public life. And we're navigating those same things today. And I think Marsha's life and her organizing and activism are so important to be studied and learned from. In 1970, she took over New York University, and she demanded that the university have open enrollment, be tuition free for people who couldn't afford it, have childcare and access to healthcare. You asked earlier about when did she start to understand herself as trans. In 1970, she was, accessing gender affirming care, and she talked about how she loved the effects of estrogen on her body. And she talked about, she's like, I have a small bust. It's not too big, but it's a handful. It's a nice handful. And she just had so much joy and that kind of self-actualization and that access to care that was happening because of organizing that she was doing and big community building that she was doing. So I think in these moments where we're navigating similar increased heightened scrutiny and violence on our communities, it's important to look to Marsha.
Is it how does it feel to have her name become so much bigger than when you started? Because, I'm thinking of this moment on Drag Race where AOC is in the untucked room and she's like, drag queens are so important. We all know who threw the first brick at Stonewall. And then she doesn't say anything.
Totally.
And then everyone's like, yeah, who?
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Also, that's not what Marsha and Sylvia did. To even have their names on a thing to get scrubbed, it's like, must be so, how does that feel for you? It must be so wild. Did you feel positive or,
I think I've over time felt a variety of emotions. There's that small group of us from Anoni to Al Michaels to John Kearns, who started researching Marsha back in 1992 and writing about her, and Randy Wicker. There's just, more that I could name, Augusta Machado, where we just often kind of look in amazement about how large her life has become. And it's a really beautiful thing that more and more people are aware of Marsha P. Johnson. And also there's so much more to her story beyond the mural that you might see, her name being invoked in Stonewall. I think Stonewall is an interesting story because Seymour Pine raided Stonewall, talks about how the trans people in the bar where, often trans people weren't even allowed in that bar, but talked about how the transvestites were the only ones giving us trouble. And there were actually two rooms in Stonewall. There was a front room where wealthier white clientele would go. And then there was a back room. It was often called the black room, right? It was where people who were transgressing gender norms would have to be going. It was where people of color would go. It's where Marsha would go when she was able to enter Stonewall. And it had a jukebox. And people who went to Stonewall who were able to be in that back room, remembered the joy that was there. It's like, yes, they were relegated to the back, but also they were there was a kind of joy and euphoria on the dance floor. And Marsha had complete recall in parts of her life of what song was playing on the jukebox when the police raided, and it was Marvin Gaye's "Heard It Through the Grapevine." And I spend the whole chapter talking about trauma and how trauma affects the memory, because a lot of people saw Marsha that night as being among the first to resist the police. And then later in the 1980s, she talked to Eric Marcus, and she gave this interview that's now in the One Archives out in LA, beautiful, important archive, about how Stonewall happened on her birthday in August and how she didn't get there till much later. And it's so, I really go in on that about how, why would someone like Marsha talk about, the date of Stonewall not being June, but being months later on her birthday, and why would she say, I wasn't involved in it? Part of it is that, even though a person like the late, great Holly Woodlawn or Mama Jean or members of the Gay Activist Alliance or all saw Marsha in those early moments leading a rebellion, Marsha herself was in the late 80s navigating immense trauma, and that really shaped her life and how she recalled. She used to say, oh, my computer is getting tangled up. She talked about her mind as a computer that, because of the life that she had lived and the violences that she survived, as we know now, like it shaped her recall. And so to me, I spend a lot of time, and I have a dear friend, Leah Lakshmi, who's a disability justice writer and artist, and she talks about how riots are not sane events. They're not neuronormal, neurotypical events. They're queer events, the neurodiverse events. So of course it makes a lot of sense that people would understand and remember it differently. And so I go all in on why, years later, Marsha would remember Stonewall as August and later than June and in that back room.
But she did remember the song.
But she remembered the song. And there was even a performance of this play by Doric Wilson called The Street. And it was about Marsha and her actions at Stonewall. And it was put on, in the 80s. And this person, Michael Michelle Lynch, who was later part of the Hot Peaches, played Marsha. And the character's name was Boom Boom. And so Marsha was sitting in the front row of Doric Wilson's The Street, correcting everybody about what was going on. She said, I was in the back, and that didn't happen that way. This happened this way. And so it's real. And this was 1980. And so, this was before she started to really call her mind her computer that was being all tangled up. At various points, there was a ACT UP activist who was, after an action, incarcerated and held at the precinct with Marsha. And that Mark Huntington was asking Marsha, like, what was going on? And Marsha was like, yeah, heard it through the grapevine. That was what was playing. This is what was going on. And she does the same kind of description in this film, Saint Marsha, that was in 1991. So, Marsha's, talked about being lost in the music. I incorporated that into my film with Sasha Wurtzel, Happy Birthday, Marsha, where time is really malleable, and she got lost in it.
It's like nothing fucking changes. Nothing fucking changes. I mean, a lot of stuff changes, and the idea that she wasn't even allowed in Stonewall sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, Stonewall was across the street. We were talking earlier about young people who were kicked out of their house because they're queer, transgressing gender norms. It was across the street from a park.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, exactly. Those young people who were in the park were central to the uprising. And they couldn't get into the Stonewall. So I think it's really important to be thinking really abundantly and expansively about not just Stonewall, but what came after when Sylvia and Marsha started Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries and took over NYU and fought for gender-affirming care and housing. So,
yeah, that you're fighting for a place you can't even always get into. That's like, It couldn't be more relevant. It's also funny because, not funny, haha, but like, I did not know about the protesting of NYU.
Oh, yeah.
And I guarantee NYU has like a thing that's like, thank you, Marsha P. Johnson or whatever. When in the past, they probably were like, this deviant is like, it's just
exactly.
Like, right?
Well, NYU, ran Bellevue Hospital, and Bellevue Hospital was a place, this was in the 60s, where people who were, queer and trans and gender nonconforming would be held, right? Like people who were transgressing gender norms or who were not straight would be held against their will. And so, absolutely, to that point that you're talking about.
They erase, I think it's frustrating to have that erased. Or to even have, like, I even said the wrong things. Seymour Prince is Seymour Pine. Like that it's sort of a like MLK-ification of her story to a certain audience, like an audience who probably wouldn't even allow her in their bars today.
Yeah, which I think is one of the reasons why it felt so. I've been kind of straight up writing this book for 5 years now, since the summer. It's been 20 years of archiving, writing about Marsha and educating my community. I remember I was an organizer at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, and we had this newsletter. This is the early 2010s, we had a newsletter called In Solidarity for our incarcerated transgender nonconforming community. And I would be writing about the things about Marsha and sharing and getting letters back and, from people who knew her. And that was a really beautiful thing too. So that is, part of why it's felt so important to write this book and to share it with the world.
How were people accessing gender affirming care back then?
Yeah, all different ways. Unfortunately, not, like Sylvia and Marsha went to doctors that gave them hormones that were not for human beings, right? They were for primates. It was really a really challenging situation to seek out care. There were other places, like in 1971, Marsha talked about being a pre-op transsexual woman. That's what she identified as. And she wanted to get bottom surgery, vaginoplasty from Johns Hopkins. Another person, Bambi Lamore, talked about that, and Dora Martin. And so there were some places that, people could get care.
Johns Hopkins was doing bottom surgery?
That's
Wow.
what she was. Yeah. So it was, that was fascinating to learn about because I wasn't familiar with it. But yeah.
Wow. So sorry to interrupt. So they were talking about accessing that.
These are people who are not having a lot of stability, right? So it's like when you're not having housing, it's hard to have any of your other basic needs met, right? That's part of why they started Star House, so that people could have a greater sense of stability in order to get like their healthcare needs met. And so, yeah.
What was Star House?
Star House was, I'm so glad you asked, the house that was, so at NYU in this basement that Sylvia and Marsha and Endora, they all took over to protest how NYU, New York University, wasn't allowing their students to have gay dance parties. They took it over and they started this group STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. And one of the things that they were noticing was, like we were talking about, all the young people who were houseless, people who were living on the street queens, they called them. And so they got a house, they got an apartment, and they let people live there with them, and they fed them, and they were really modeling it off of the Black Panther Party, like breakfast programs and being in community with other people who were dreaming really big about transforming the world. And so that was Star House, and it operated for a few years, and it was a really beautiful part of Marsha's legacy.
It was in a basement at NYU?
Yeah, that's the room that they took over, the Weinstein Hall basement, and that's where they dreamed up the Star Manifesto and the Star organization.
Did they know they were there?
Did NYU know they were there?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was like an occupation. So NYU called in the tactical police, which was, the modern day version is the SWAT team, right, to evict them. And they evicted them, but it was an occupation of the basement. First NYU administrators turned up the AC, hoping that would get them out, and then they called in the police to clear out the whole basement. It was an occupation that included students and student leaders and street queens and street kids.
How long were they there?
It's like 7 days or something like that.
Well, it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's inspiring. It's an experiment in democracy, right? A lot of times these things don't live that long, but the legacy and the action and the impact are, we're still talking about it today.
What was Sylvia Rivera? I know probably you know of her mostly in relation to Marsha, but what was she doing? Where was she? Were they like best friends?
Yeah, so they were really, really close. Sylvia talks about Marsha having plugged in the light for her, right? Like someone who she just looked up to and helped instill a greater sense of value and worthiness. And so Sylvia met Marsha when she was 13 years old in Times Square. and they hung out together, and then they started to organize together. And the Gay Activist Alliance, which was the group that sprung up after Stonewall, right? All of these kind of gay groups started to spring up, and Sylvia got really, really involved in that and started to organize with them. And there was a bill that they were hoping that the New York City City Council would pass that would make it illegal to discriminate against openly queer, transgender, nonconforming people. It was called Intro 175. And so, yeah, that Sylvia was really adamant about that. And she did it she went up to Times Square because that's where her people were. And she held that clipboard in Times Square and marched all the way to Bryant Park and then in front of the New York Public Library, where decades later I found out more about her life. And she was right there. And then she helped start STAR with Marsha in the basement of NYU and organized. And then by 1973, there was an incredibly deep backlash against trans people within the quote unquote gay rights movement, right? People were saying that trans people were making a mockery of real women, this kind of like latent deep transphobia.
Nothing has changed.
Nothing has changed, right? This kind of turfdom. And then, so in 1973, Sylvia took a big break from the movement and for about 20 years moved up to Tarrytown, which is a suburb of New York City north of Manhattan.
She just lived there? She just was like, I'm living a quiet life?
Yeah, she was living a quiet... I mean, she really went hard. She was navigating substance use and, after the Pride rally in 1973, because she had to fight her way on stage to remind people about trans people in prison and about gay people in prison. And she, was physically beaten. And then she gave this incredible, speech, Y'all Better Quiet Down, which I remember I found a VHS copy of and I uploaded it to the internet. This was, 15 years ago or something like that, because it wasn't on the internet before. And it was so moving and inspiring in that moment. And then what happened was she was so exhausted and burnt out for fighting for people who didn't care about her. Yeah. She went back to her apartment and tried to commit suicide. And Marsha burst down the door with her friend Terry, broke down the door. Marsha had this strong intuition that something was wrong, so rushed home, broke down the door and took Sylvia to Bellevue, told Sylvia, like, you're not crossing the River Jordan by yourself. That's what they called kind of going to the other side. And they called the Hudson River the River Jordan. She said, you're not crossing the River Jordan by yourself. Me and you are crossing it together. So they kind of made this pact for Sylvia to stay alive. Sylvia's own mother had tried to kill her as a young child and killed herself. So for Sylvia to drink rat poison and took rat poison herself, Sylvia's mother, and died. And that's why Sylvia ended up living with her grandmother. And so Sylvia lived a really big life by the time 1973 had rolled around and decided that she needed a break from the movement and moved up to Tarrytown.
How old is she at the point that she moves to Tarrytown?
In her 20s.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, I'm telling you, it's so wild to think about, right? Like how young people are, and yeah,
and how much people say now, oh, they're young, they don't know anything, but then
exactly. But actually, the movement was started by young people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How did Sylvia pass away?
She had cancer.
Oh, and I assume they never figured out who shot Marsha, or that person didn't suffer consequences.
The taxi driver in 1981? Yeah. No, they didn't find that person. No.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So, wow. Did Sylvia ever go back to organizing, or she's just like...
Yeah, definitely. So that's a really beautiful part too. So and it's kind of a full circle moment. She helped start this group called Fierce, before she died. And that was a group for young, queer, transgender, nonconforming people on the pier. And that was a group I joined after I moved to New York, and we were fighting against this curfew. The city wanted to enforce a curfew for like young queer and trans people in the West Village because, we were deemed a nuisance. Even though this was NYU, they weren't going to enforce it for college students. It was just about,
of course.
So So yeah, I joined Fierce, and it was kind of in that context I was starting to learn about people who came before and why it felt so important to share them.
You met Sylvia?
No, no, she was. I mean, not that I remember, but she passed in '02. So
Oh, okay. Wow. So what has been the most surprising, or I mean, you have a lot of stories about her, but what's like a fun or surprising, or something along the lines of the story about her being at that play and objecting to everything? What are some of your favorites?
some of my favorites are, you hear about Sylvia Rivera mostly in the context of organizing and activism, but she had such a smile in her voice. I was listening to this interview that she did with Steve Watson, who is a journalist and was writing for the Village Voice, and she talks about seeing Marsha on stage, right? Like, it's such a world-bending, moment where you're hearing Sylvia talk about like the performance aspect of Marsha and seeing Marsha, shine her light in such a powerful way. And Sylvia's like, I went and I saw it so many times. And so that's a beautiful moment. Marsha was a person who knew that the problems of the day were just the launching pad for big, big dreams that could encompass and feed and fuel her community for years to come. And so that's what she was doing in those hot spring hotels. She would gather her friends and they would ask the same questions about when might we feel a little bit freer? How will this situation change? And they just asked that question over and over and over again until they knew so deeply that that dream could become a reality, that thought could become a thing. And they, had great timing to usher it into being. I love that even though the obstacles were so big, Marsha B. Johnson was also Marsha Pay It No Mind Johnson, right? She knew that, yes, things are hard, but also when things were getting in her way, she would pay it no mind. And that is so beautiful, right? That's about focus. That's about putting your focus where you want to see the subject grow. And so if things are really hard, you can pivot your focus to what is easier and appreciate that and help grow that. And that's what she did all the time. She was also, like a caretaker in the early HIV/AIDS epidemic. She would care for her roommates and her friends. And she was also an LA girly. She lived in West Hollywood, on Skid Row, and in Calabasas. I went to her house in Calabasas, and there's a beautiful olive tree in front of it. There's these gorgeous Polaroid photographs of her in front of a pool it's the same house in Calabasas, wearing this beautiful blue dress and in front of a rose bush, and she's just smiling so joyously. And that is why the biography, which is the first biography to ever exist, is called The Joy and Defiance of Marsha P. Johnson, because she knew that joy is what we're fighting for. And in a place of joy, she had the best clarity around the solutions for the real problems that she and her community faced.
Thank you so much for being here. That was I can't say anything better than that, obviously, but I haven't researched this person for 20 years. Wow. Okay. So where can people find you and the book, and what would you want them to take away from the book?
Yeah, so you can buy Marsha, the Joy and Defiance of Marsha B. Johnson, anywhere books are sold. And it's also, I read it as an audiobook. So you can get that from the library. You can also get Marsha from the library. I wrote the book in the library, in 2 different libraries. I think it's really important to shout out our libraries in this moment. And I'm on Instagram, Tourmaline with 3 eyes. And I'll be touring with the book on May 20th, the day it comes out. I will be at the Cambridge Public Library on May 21st. I'll be with Uncle Bobby's Bookstore in Philadelphia on May 22nd. I will be at the Brooklyn Museum with Phoebe Robinson, and my dear friend Egypt LaBeija is going to perform. And then I'll be in LA on June 14th at the LGBT Center. I'm just really excited to travel with Marsha's message in this moment.
Yeah. Oh, Cambridge Library is wonderful. That's a great place to start.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. This means so much to me.
Bad with Money with Gabriel S. Dunn is a production of Noted Bisexual, produced by Melisa D. Monts and Diamond MPrint Productions. Edited by Diane Kang, post-production sound by Coco Llorens, production assistance by Melanie D. Watson, and music by Mike Kaplan, Zach Sherwin, and Jack Dolgen, sung by Sam Barbera. Thank you, love you, bye!